Chapter 25 of She. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by redabrus. She by H. Rider Haggard. The Spirit of Life. I did as I was bid, and in fear and trembling felt myself guided over the edge of the stone. I sprawled my legs out, but could touch nothing. "I am going to fall," I gasped. "Nay, let thyself go, and trust to me," answered Asha. Now, if the position is considered, it will be easily understood that this was a greater demand upon my confidence than was justified by my knowledge of Asha's character. For all I knew, she might be in the very act of consigning me to a horrible doom. But in life we sometimes have to lay our faith upon strange altars, and so it was now. "Let thyself go," she cried, and having no choice, I did. I felt myself slide a pace or two down the sloping surface of the rock, and then pass into the air, and the thought flashed through my brain that I was lost. But no, in another instant my feet struck against a rocky floor, and I felt that I was standing upon something solid, and out of reach of the wind, which I could hear singing away overhead. As I stood there thanking heaven for these small mercies, there was a slip and a scuffle, and down came Leo alongside of me. "Hullo, old fellow," he called out. "Are you there? This is getting interesting, is it not?" Just then, with a terrific yell, Job arrived right on the top of us, knocking us both down. By the time we had struggled to our feet again, Asha was standing among us, and bidding us light the lamps, which fortunately remained uninjured, and also did the spare jar of oil. I got out my box of wax matches, and they struck as merrily there, in that awful place, as they could have done in a London drawing room. In a couple of minutes both the lamps were alight, and revealed a curious scene. We were huddled together in a rocky chamber, some 10 feet square, and scared enough we looked, that is, except Asha, who was standing calmly with her arms folded and waiting for the lamps to burn up. The chamber appeared to be partly natural and partly hollowed out of the top of the cone. The roof of the natural part was formed of the swinging stone, and that of the back part of the chamber, which sloped downwards, was hewn from live rock. For the rest, the place was warm and dry, a perfect haven of rest compared to the giddy pinnacle above, and the quivering spur that shot out to meet it in mid air. "So," said she, "safely have we come, though once I feared that the rocking stone would fall with you, and precipitate you into the bottomless depths beneath. For I do believe that the cleft goeth down to the very womb of the world. The rock whereon the stone resteth hath crumbled beneath the swinging weight. And now that he," nodding towards Job, who was sitting on the floor, feebly wiping his forehead with a red cotton pocket handkerchief, "whom they rightly call the pig, for as a pig is he stupid, hath let fall the plank, it will not be easy to return across the gulf, and to that end must I make a plan. But now rest awhile, and look upon this place. What think ye that it is?" "We know not," I answered. "Wouldst thou believe, O holy, that once a man did choose this airy nest for a daily habitation, and did here endure for many years, leaving it only but one day in every 12 to seek food and water and oil that the people brought, more than he could carry, and laid as an offering in the mouth of the tunnel through which we passed hither?" We looked up wonderingly, and she continued, "Yet so it was. There was a man, Newt he named himself, who, though he lived in the latter days, had of the wisdom of the sons of Kor. A hermit was he, and a philosopher, and greatly skilled in the secrets of nature. And he it was who discovered the fire that I shall show you, which is nature's blood and life, and also that he who bathed therein and breathed thereof should live while nature lives. But like unto thee, O holy, this man, Newt, would not turn his knowledge to account. Ill, he said, was it for man to live, for man was born to die. Therefore did he tell his secret to none, and therefore did he come and live here, where the seeker after life must pass, and was revered of the Amahagger of the day as holy, and a hermit. And when first I came to this country, knowest thou how I came, Callicrates? Another time I will tell thee, for it is a strange tale. I heard of this philosopher, and waited for him when he came to fetch his food, and returned with him hither, though greatly did I fear to tread the gulf. Then did I beguile him with my beauty and my wit, and flatter him with my tongue, so that he led me down and showed me the fire, and told me the secrets of the fire. But he would not suffer me to step therein, and fearing lest he should slay me, I refrained, knowing that the man was very old and soon would die. And I returned, having learned from him all that he knew of the wonderful spirit of the world. And that was much, for the man was wise and very ancient, and by purity and abstinence, and the contemplations of his innocent mind, had worn thin the veil between that which we see and the great invisible truths, the whisper of whose wings at times we hear as they sweep through the gross air of the world. Then it was but a very few days after I met thee, my Callicrates, who hadst wandered hither with the beautiful Egyptian Amenartus, and I learned to love for the first and last time, once and for ever, so that it entered into my mind to come hither with thee, and receive the gift of life for thee and me. Therefore came we, with that Egyptian who would not be left behind, and, behold, we found the old man Newt lying but newly dead. There he lay, and his white beard covered him like a garment. And she pointed to a spot near where I was sitting. But surely he hath long since crumbled into dust, and the wind hath borne his ashes hence. Here I put out my hand and felt in the dust, and presently my fingers touched something. It was a human tooth, very yellow, but sound. I held it up and showed it to Asha, who laughed. Yes, she said, it is his without a doubt. Behold what remaineth of Newt, and the wisdom of Newt, one little tooth. And yet that man had all life at his command, and for his conscience' sake would have none of it. Well, he lay there newly dead, and we descended whither I shall lead you, and then, gathering up all my courage, and courting death that I might perchance win so glorious a crown of life, I stepped into the flames, and behold, life such as ye can never know until ye feel it also, flowed into me, and I came forth undying and lovely beyond imagining. Then did I stretch out mine arms to thee, Callicrates, and bid thee take thine immortal bride, and behold, as I spoke, thou, blinded by my beauty, didst turn from me, and throw thine arms about the neck of Amenartus. And then a great fury filled me, and made me mad, and I seized the javelin that thou didst bear, and stabbed thee, so that there, at my very feet, in the place of life, thou didst groan and go down into death. I knew not then that I had strength to slay with mine eyes and by the power of my will. Therefore, in my madness, slew I with the javelin. It will be observed that Asha's account of the death of Callicrates differs materially from that written on the potsherd by Amenartus. The writing on the shred says, then in her rage did she smite him by her magic, and he died. We never ascertained which was the correct version, but it will be remembered that the body of Callicrates had a spear wound in the breast, which seems conclusive, unless indeed it was inflicted after death. Another thing that we never ascertained was how the two women, she and the Egyptian Amenartus, were able to bear the corpse of the man they both loved across the dread gulf and along the shaking spur. What a spectacle the two distracted creatures must have presented in their grief and loveliness as they toiled along that awful place with the dead man between them. Probably, however, the passage was easier than L.H.H. And when thou wast dead, ah, I wept, because I was undying, and thou wast dead. I wept there in the place of life, so that had I been mortal any more, my heart had surely broken. And she, the swart Egyptian, she cursed me by her gods. By Osiris did she curse me, and by Isis, by Nephthys, and by Anubis, by Sekhet, the cat headed, and by Set, calling down evil on me, evil and everlasting desolation. Ah, I can see her dark face now, lowering over me like a storm, but she could not hurt me, and I know not if I could hurt her. I did not try it, it was not to me then. So together we bore thee hence, and afterwards I sent her, the Egyptian, away through the swamps, and it seems that she lived to bear a son, and to write the tale that should lead thee, her husband, back to me, her rival and thy murderess. Such is the tale, my love, and now is the hour at hand that shall set a crown upon it. Like all things on the earth, it is compounded of evil and of good, more of evil than of good, perchance, and writ in letters of blood. It is the truth, not have I hidden from thee, Callicrates. And now one thing before the final moment of thy trial. We go down in the presence of death, for life and death are very near together, and who knoweth that might happen which should separate us from another space of waiting. I am but a woman, and no prophetess, and I cannot read the future. But this I know, for I learned it from the lips of the wise man Newt, that my life is but prolonged and made more bright. It cannot live for aye. Therefore, before we go, tell me, O Callicrates, that of a truth thou dost forgive me, and dost love me from thy heart. See, Callicrates, much evil have I done. Perchance it was evil but 2 nights ago to strike that girl who loved thee cold in death. But she disobeyed me and angered me, professing misfortune to me, and I smote. Be careful when power comes to thee also, lest thou too shouldst smite in thine anger or thy jealousy, for unconquerable strength is a sore weapon in the hands of erring man. Yea, I have sinned. Out of the bitterness born of a great love have I sinned. But yet do I know the good from the evil, nor is my heart altogether hardened. Thy love, Callicrates, shall be the gate of my redemption, even as aforetime my passion was the path down which I ran to evil. For deep love unsatisfied is the hell of noble hearts and a portion of the accursed. But love that is mirror backed, more perfect from the soul of our desired, doth fashion wings to lift us above ourselves, and makes us what we might be. Therefore, Callicrates, take me by the hand, and lift my veil with no more fear than though I were some peasant girl, and not the wisest and most beauteous woman in this wide world, and look me in the eyes, and tell me that thou dost forgive me with all thine heart, and that will all thine heart thou dost worship me. She paused, and the strange tenderness in her voice seemed to hover round us like a memory. I know that the sound of it moved me more even than her words. It was so very human, so very womanly. Leo, too, was strangely touched. Hitherto he had been fascinated against his better judgment, something as a bird is fascinated by a snake, but now I think that all this passed away, and he realized that he really loved this strange and glorious creature, as alas, I loved her also. At any rate, I saw his eyes fill with tears, and he stepped swiftly to her and undid the gauzy veil, and then took her by the hand, and gazing into her deep eyes, said aloud, Asha, I love thee with all my heart, and so far as forgiveness is possible, I forgive thee the death of Ustane. For the rest, it is between thee and thy Maker. I know not of it. I only know that I love thee as I never loved before, and that I will cleave to thee to the end. Now, answered Asha, with proud humility. Now when my lord doth speak thus royally, and give with so free a hand, it cannot become me to lag behind in words, and be beggared of my generosity. Behold, and she took his hand and placed it upon her shapely head, and then bent herself slowly down till one knee for an instant touched the ground. Behold, in token of submission do I bow me to my lord. Behold, and she kissed him on the lips. In token of my wifely love do I kiss my lord. Behold, and she laid her hand upon his heart. By the sin I sinned, by my lonely centuries of waiting wherewith it was wiped out, by the great love wherewith I love, and by the Spirit, the eternal thing that doth beget all life, from whom it ebbs, to whom it doth return again, I swear, even in this most holy hour of completed womanhood, that I will abandon evil and cherish good. I swear that I will be ever guided by thy voice in the straightest path of duty. I swear that I will eschew ambition, and through all my length of endless days set wisdom over me as a guiding star to lead me on to truth and a knowledge of the right. I swear also that I will honor and will cherish thee, Callicrates, who hast been swept by the wave of time back into my arms, till the very end, come it soon or late. I swear, nay, I will swear no more, for what are words? Yet shalt thou learn that Asha hath no false tongue. So I have sworn, and thou, my holy, art witness to my oath. Here too are we wed, my husband, with the gloom for bridal canopy, wed till the end of all things. Here do we write our marriage vows upon the rushing winds which shall bear them up to heaven, and continually round this rolling world. And for a bridal gift I crown thee with my beauty's starry crown, and enduring life, and wisdom without measure, and wealth that none can count. Behold, the great ones of the earth shall creep about thy feet, and its fair women shall cover up their eyes because of the shining glory of thy countenance, and its wise ones shall be abased before thee. Thou shalt read the hearts of men as an open writing, and hither and thither shalt thou lead them as thy pleasure listeth. Like that old Sphinx of Egypt shalt thou sit aloft from age to age, and ever shall they cry to thee to solve the riddle of thy greatness that doth not pass away, and ever shalt thou mock them with thy silence. Behold, once more I kiss thee, and by that kiss I give to thee dominion over sea and earth, over the peasant in his hovel, over the monarch in his palace halls, and cities crowned with towers, and those who breathe therein. Wherever the sun shakes out his spears, and the lonesome waters mirror up the moon, wherever storms roll, and heaven's painted bows arc in the sky, from the pure north clad in snows, across the middle spaces of the world, to where the amorous south, lying like a bride upon her blue couch of seas, breathes in sighs made sweet with the odor of myrtles, there shall thy power pass, and thy dominion find a home. Nor sickness, nor icy fingered fear, nor sorrow, and pale waste of form and mind hovering ever over humanity, shall so much as shadow thee with the shadow of their wings. As a god shalt thou be, holding good and evil in the hollow of thy hand, and I, even I humble myself before thee. Such is the power of love, and such is the bridal gift I give unto thee, Callicrates, my lord and lord of all. And now it is done. Now for thee I lose my virgin zone, and come storm, come shine, come good, come evil, come life, come death, it never, never can be undone. For of a truth that which is and being done is done for aye and cannot be altered. I have said. Let us hence, that all things may be accomplished in their order. And taking one of the lamps, She advanced towards the end of the chamber that was roofed in by the swaying stone, where she halted. We followed her, and perceived that in the wall of the cone there was a stair, or, to be more accurate, that some projecting knobs of rock had been so shaped as to form a good imitation of a stair. Down this Asha began to climb, springing from step to step like a chamois, and after her we followed with less grace. When we had descended some 15 or 16 steps, we found that they ended in a tremendous rocky slope, running first outwards and then inwards, like the slope of an inverted cone or tunnel. The slope was very steep and often precipitous, but it was nowhere impassable, and by the light of the lamps we went down it with no great difficulty, though it was gloomy work enough travelling on thus, no one of us knew whither, into the dead heart of a volcano. As we went, however, I took the precaution of noting our route as well as I could, and this was not so very difficult, owing to the extraordinary and most fantastic shape of the rocks that were strewn about, many of which in that dim light looked more like the grim faces carven upon medieval gargoyles than ordinary boulders. For a long time we travelled on thus, half an hour I should say, till, after we had descended for many hundreds of feet, I perceived that we were reaching the point of the inverted cone. In another minute we were there, and found that at the very apex of the funnel was a passage, so low and narrow that we had to stoop as we crept along it in Indian file. After some 50 yards of this creeping, the passage suddenly widened into a cave, so huge that we could see neither the roof nor the sides. We only knew that it was a cave by the echo of our tread and the perfect quiet of the heavy air. On we went for many minutes in absolute awed silence, like lost souls in the depths of Hades, Asha's white and ghost like form flitting in front of us, till once more the place ended in a passage which opened into a second cavern much smaller than the first. Indeed, we could clearly make out the arch and stony banks of the second cave, and from their rent and jagged appearance discovered that, like the first long passage down which we had passed through the cliff before we reached the quivering spur, it had, to all appearance, been torn in the bowels of the rocky by the terrific force of some explosive gas. At length this cave ended in a third passage, through which gleamed a faint glow of light. I heard Asha give a sigh of relief as this light dawned upon us. "It is well," she said. "Prepare to enter the very womb of the earth, wherein she doth conceive the life that you see brought forth in man and beast, ay, and in every tree and flower." Swiftly she sped along, and after her we stumbled as best we might, our hearts filled like a cup with mingled dread and curiosity. What were we about to see? We passed down the tunnel. Stronger and stronger the light beamed, reaching us in great flashes, like the rays from a lighthouse, as one by one they are thrown wide upon the darkness of the waters. Nor was this all, for with the flashes came a soul shaking sound like that of thunder and of crashing trees. Now we were through it, and oh heavens! We stood in a third cavern, some 50 feet in length by perhaps as great a height, and 30 wide. It was carpeted with fine white sand, and its walls had been worn smooth by the action of I know not what. The cavern was not dark like the others. It was filled with a soft glow of rose colored light, more beautiful to look on than anything that can be conceived. But at first we saw no flashes, and heard no more of the thunderous sound. Presently, however, as we stood in amaze, gazing at the marvellous sight, and wondering whence the rosy radiance flowed, a dread and beautiful thing happened. Across the far end of the cavern, with a grinding and crashing noise, a noise so dreadful and awe inspiring that we all trembled, and Job actually sank to his knees, there flamed out an awful cloud or pillar of fire like a rainbow many coloured, and like the lightning bright. For a space, perhaps 40 seconds, it flamed and roared thus, turning slowly round and round, and then by degrees the terrible noise ceased, and with the fire it passed away. I know not where, leaving behind it the same rosy glow that we had first seen. Draw near!" cried Asha, with a voice of thrilling exultation. "Behold the very fountain and heart of life as it beats in the bosom of the great world. Behold the substance from which all things draw their energy, the bright spirit of the globe, without which it cannot live, but must grow cold and dead as the dead moon. Draw near, and wash you in the living flames, and take their virtue into your poor frames in all its virgin strength, not as it now feebly glows within your bosoms, filtered thereto through all the fine strainers of 1,000 intermediate lives, but as it is here in the very fount and seat of earthly being." We followed her through the rosy glow up to the head of the cave, till at last we stood before the spot where the great pulse beat and the great flame passed, and as we went we became sensible of a wild and splendid exhilaration, of a glorious sense of such a fierce intensity of life that the most buoyant moments of our strength seemed flat and tame and feeble beside it. It was the mere effluvium of the flame, the subtle ether that it cast off as it passed, working on us, and making us feel strong as giants and swift as eagles. We reached the head of the cave, and gazed at each other in the glorious glow, and laughed aloud. Even Job laughed, and he had not laughed for a week, in the lightness of our hearts and the divine intoxication of our brains. I know that I felt as though all the varied genius of which the human intellect is capable had descended upon me. I could have spoken in blank verse of Shakespearean beauty. All sorts of great ideas flashed through my mind. It was as though the bonds of my flesh had been loosened and left the spirit free to soar to the empyrean of its native power. The sensations that poured in upon me are indescribable. I seemed to live more keenly, to reach to a higher joy, and sip the goblet of a subtler thought than ever it had been my lot to do before. I was another and most glorified self, and all the avenues of the possible were for a space laid open to the footsteps of the real. Then suddenly, whilst I rejoiced in the splendid vigour of a new founded self, from far, far away there came a dreadful muttering noise that grew and grew to a crash and a roar, which combined in itself all that is terrible and yet splendid in the possibilities of sound. Nearer it came, and nearer yet, till it was close upon us, rolling down like all the thunder wheels of heaven behind the horses of the lightning. On it came, and with it came the glorious blinding cloud of many colored light, and stood before us for a space, turning, as it seemed to us, slowly round and round, and then, accompanied by its attendant pomp and sound, passed away I know not whither. So astonishing was the wondrous sight that one and all of us, save she who stood up and stretched her hands towards the fire, sank down before it, and hid our faces in the sand. When it was gone, Asha spoke. "Now, Callicrates," she said, "the mighty moment is at hand. When the great flame comes again, thou must stand in it. First throw aside thy garments, for it will burn them, though thee it will not hurt. Thou must stand in the flame while thy senses will endure, and when it embraces thee suck the fire down into thy very heart, and let it leap and play around thy every part, so that thou lose no moiety of its virtue. Hearest thou me, Callicrates?" "I hear thee, Asha," answered Leo, "but of a truth I am no coward, but I doubt me of that raging flame. How know I that it will not utterly destroy me, so that I lose myself and lose thee also? Nevertheless will I do it," he added. Asha thought for a minute and then said, "It is not wonderful that thou shouldst doubt. Tell me, Callicrates, if thou seest me stand in the flame and come forth unharmed, wilt thou enter also?" "Yes," he answered, "I will enter even if it slay me. I have said that I will enter now." "And that will I also," I cried. "What, my holy?" She laughed aloud. "Methought that thou wouldst not of length of days. Why, how is this?" Nay, I know not, I answered. But there is that in my heart that calleth me to taste of the flame and live. It is well, she said. Thou art not altogether lost in folly. See now, I will for the second time bathe me in this living bath. Fain would I add to my beauty and my length of days, if that be possible. If it be not possible, at least it cannot harm me. Also, she continued, after a momentary pause, is there another and a deeper cause why I would once again dip me in the flame? When first I tasted of its virtue, full was my heart of passion and of hatred of that Egyptian Amynetus, and therefore, despite my strivings to be rid thereof, have passion and hatred been stamped upon my soul from that sad hour to this. But now it is otherwise. Now is my mood a happy mood, and filled am I with the purest part of thought, and so would I ever be. Therefore, Callicrates, will I once more wash, and make me pure and clean, and yet more fit for thee. Therefore also, when thou dost in turn stand in the fire, empty all thy heart of evil, and let soft contentment hold the balance of thy mind. Shake, loose thy spirit's wings, and take thy stand upon the utter verge of holy contemplation. Ay, dream upon thy mother's kiss, and turn thee towards the vision of the highest good that hath ever swept on silver wings across the silence of thy dreams. For from the germ of what thou art in that dread moment shall grow the fruit of what thou shalt be for all unreckoned time. Now prepare thee, prepare, even as though thy last hour were at hand, and thou wast to cross the land of shadows, and not through the gates of glory into the realms of life made beautiful. Prepare, I say. End of chapter 25. Recording by redabrus, January 2008.
Chapter 26 of She by H. Rider Haggard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristine. She by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 26 What We Saw. Then came a few moments' pause, during which Ayesha seemed to be gathering up her strength for the fiery trial, while we clung to each other and waited in utter silence. At last, from far, far away, came the first murmur of sound, that grew and grew till it began to crash and bellow in the distance. As she heard it, Ayesha swiftly threw off her gauzy wrapping, loosened the golden snake from her kirtle, and then, shaking her lovely hair about her like a garment, beneath its cover slipped the kirtle off, and replaced the snaky belt around her and outside the masses of her falling hair. There she stood before us as Eve might have stood before Adam, clad in nothing but her abundant locks, held round her by the golden band, and no words of mine can tell how sweet she looked, and yet how divine. Nearer and nearer came the thunder wheels of fire, and as they came she pushed one ivory arm through the dark masses of her hair and flung it round Leo's neck. "Oh, my love," she murmured, "wilt thou ever know how I have loved thee?" And she kissed him on the forehead, and then went and stood in the pathway of the flame of life. There was, I remember, to my mind something very touching about her words and that embrace upon the forehead. It was like a mother's kiss, and seemed to convey a benediction with it. On came the crashing rolling noise, and the sound of it was as the sound of a forest being swept flat by a mighty wind, and then tossed up like so much grass, and thundered down a mountain side. Nearer and nearer it came. No flashes of light, forerunners of the revolving pillar of flame, were passing like arrows through the rosy air, and now the edge of the pillar itself appeared. Ayesha turned towards it, and stretched out her arms to greet it. On it came very slowly, and lapped her round with flame. I saw the fire run up her form. I saw her lift it with both hands as though it were water, and pour it over her head. I even saw her open her mouth and draw it down into her lungs, and a dread and wonderful sight it was. Then she paused, and stretched out her arms, and stood there quite still, with a heavenly smile upon her face, as though she were the very spirit of the flame. The mysterious fire played up and down her dark and rolling locks, twining and twisting itself through and around them like threads of golden lace. It gleamed upon her ivory breast and shoulder, from which the hair had slipped aside. It slid along her pillared throat and delicate features, and seemed to find a home in the glorious eyes that shone and shone, more brightly even than the spiritual essence. Oh, how beautiful she looked there in the flame! No angel out of heaven could have worn a greater loveliness. Even now my heart faints before the recollection of it, as she stood and smiled at our awed faces, and I would give half my remaining time upon this earth to see her once like that again. But suddenly, more suddenly than I can describe, a kind of change came over her face, a change which I could not define or explain, but none the less a change. The smile vanished, and in its place there came a dry, hard look. The rounded face seemed to grow pinched, as though some great anxiety were leaving its impress upon it. The glorious eyes, too, lost their light, and, as I thought, the form its perfect shape and erectness. I rubbed my eyes, thinking that I was the victim of some hallucination, or that the refraction from the intense light produced an optical delusion, and, as I did so, the flaming pillar slowly twisted and thundered off whithersoever it passes to in the bowels of the great earth, leaving Ayesha standing where it had been. As soon as it was gone she stepped forward to Leo's side. It seemed to me that there was no spring in her step, and stretched out her hand to lay it on his shoulder. I gazed at her arm. Where was its wonderful roundness and beauty? It was getting thin and angular, and her face, by heaven, her face was growing old before my eyes. I suppose that Leo saw it also; certainly he recoiled a step or two. "What is it, my Kallikrates?" she said, and her voice, what was the matter with those deep and thrilling notes? They were quite high and cracked. "Why, what is it? What is it?" she said confusedly. "I feel dazed. Surely the quality of the fire hath not altered. Can the principle of life alter? Tell me, Kallikrates, is there aught wrong with my eyes? I see not clear." And she put her hand to her head and touched her hair, and oh, horror of horrors, it all fell upon the floor. "Oh, look, look, look!" shrieked Job in a shrill falsetto of terror, his eyes nearly dropping out of his head, and foam upon his lips. "Look, look, look! She is shrivelling up! She is turning into a monkey!" And down he fell upon the ground, foaming and gnashing in a fit. True enough, I faint even as I write it in the living presence of that terrible recollection. She was shrivelling up. The golden snakes that had encircled her gracious form slipped over her hips and to the ground. Smaller and smaller she grew, her skin changed colour, and in place of the perfect whiteness of its lustre it turned dirty brown and yellow, like a piece of withered parchment. She felt at her head; the delicate hand was nothing but a claw now, a human talon like that of a badly preserved Egyptian mummy. And then she seemed to realize what kind of change was passing over her, and she shrieked. Ah, she shrieked! She rolled upon the floor and shrieked. Smaller she grew, and smaller yet, till she was no larger than a monkey. Now the skin was puckered into a million wrinkles, and on the shapeless face was the stamp of unutterable age. I never saw anything like it. Nobody ever saw anything like the frightful age that was graven on that fearful countenance, no bigger now than that of a 2 months' child, though the skull remained the same size, or nearly so, and let all men pray they never may, if they wish to keep their reason. At last she lay still, or only feebly moving. She who but 2 minutes before had gazed upon us the loveliest, noblest, most splendid woman the world has ever seen, she lay still before us, near the masses of her own dark hair, no larger than a big monkey, and hideous, ah, too hideous for words. And yet, think of this, at that very moment I thought of it, it was the same woman. She was dying, we saw it, and thanked God, for while she lived she could feel, and what must she have felt? She raised herself upon her bony hands, and blindly gazed around her, swaying her head slowly from side to side as a tortoise does. She could not see, for her whitish eyes were covered with a horny film. Oh, the horrible pathos of the sight! But she could still speak. "Kallikrates," she said in husky, trembling notes, "forget me not. Kallikrates, have pity on my shame. I shall come again, and shall once more be beautiful. I swear it. It is true. Oh!" And she fell upon her face and was still. On the very spot where more than 20 centuries before she had slain Kallikrates the priest, she herself fell down and died. I know not how long we remained thus, many hours I suppose. When at last I opened my eyes, the other two were still outstretched upon the floor. The rosy light yet beamed like a celestial dawn, and the thunder wheels of the Spirit of Life yet rolled upon their accustomed track, for as I awoke the great pillar was passing away. There, too, lay the hideous little monkey frame, covered with crinkled yellow parchment, that once had been the glorious she. Alas! it was no hideous dream, it was an awful and unparalleled fact. What had happened to bring this shocking change about? Had the nature of the life giving fire changed? Did it perhaps from time to time send forth an essence of death instead of an essence of life? Or was it that the frame, once charged with its marvellous virtue, could bear no more, so that were the process repeated, it mattered not at what lapse of time, the two impregnations neutralized each other and left the body on which they acted as it was before it ever came into contact with the very essence of life? This, and this alone, would account for the sudden and terrible aging of Ayesha, as the whole length of her 2000 years took effect upon her. I have not the slightest doubt myself but that the frame now lying before me was just what the frame of a woman would be if by any extraordinary means life could be preserved in her till she at length died at the age of 22 centuries. But who can tell what had happened? There was the fact. Often since that awful hour I have reflected that it requires no great imagination to see the finger of Providence in the matter. Ayesha locked up in her living tomb, waiting from age to age for the coming of her lover, worked but a small change in the order of the world. But Ayesha, strong and happy in her love, clothed in immortal youth and goddess beauty and the wisdom of the centuries, would have revolutionized society and even perchance have changed the destiny of mankind. Thus she opposed herself against the eternal law, and, strong though she was, by it was swept back to nothingness, swept back with shame and hideous mockery. For some minutes I lay faintly turning these terrors over in my mind, while my physical strength came back to me, which it quickly did in that buoyant atmosphere. Then I bethought me of the others, and staggered to my feet to see if I could arouse them. But first I took up Ayesha's kirtle and the gauzy scarf with which she had been wont to hide her dazzling loveliness from the eyes of man, and, averting my head so that I might not look upon it, covered up that dreadful relic of the glorious dead, that shocking epitome of human beauty and human life. I did this hurriedly, fearing lest Leo should recover and see it again. Then, stepping over the perfumed masses of dark hair that lay upon the sand, I stooped down by Job, who was lying upon his face, and turned him over. As I did so his arm fell back in a way that I did not like, and which sent a chill through me, and I glanced sharply at him. One look was enough. Our old and faithful servant was dead. His nerves, already shattered by all he had seen and undergone, had utterly broken down beneath this last dire sight, and he had died of terror, or in a fit brought on by terror. I had only to look at his face to see it. It was another blow, but perhaps it may help people to understand how overwhelming, awful was the experience through which we had passed. We did not feel it much at the time. It seemed quite natural that the poor fellow should be dead. When Leo came to himself, which he did with a groan and trembling of the limbs about 10 minutes afterwards, and I told him that Job was dead, he merely said, "Oh!" And, mind you, this was from no heartlessness, for he and Job were much attached to each other, and he often talks of him now with the deepest regret and affection. It was only that his nerves would bear no more. A harp can give out but a certain quantity of sound, however heavily it is smitten. Well, I set myself to recovering Leo, who, to my infinite relief, I found was not dead, but only fainting, and in the end I succeeded, as I have said, and he sat up. And then I saw another dreadful thing. When we entered that awful place, his curling hair had been of the ruddiest gold, now it was turning grey, and by the time we reached the outer air it was snow white. Besides, he looked 20 years older. "What is to be done, old fellow?" he said in a hollow, dead sort of voice, when his mind had cleared a little, and the recollection of what had happened forced itself upon it. "Try and get out, I suppose," I answered; "that is, unless you would like to go in there," and I pointed to the column of fire that was once more rolling by. "I would go in if I were sure that it would kill me," he said with a little laugh. "It was my cursed hesitation that did this. If I had not been doubtful, she might never have tried to show me the road. But I am not sure. The fire might have the opposite effect upon me. It might make me immortal, and, old fellow, I have not the patience to wait a couple of thousand years for her to come back again as she did for me. I had rather die when my hour comes, and I should fancy that it isn't far off either, and go my ways to look for her. Do you go in if you like." But I merely shook my head. My excitement was as dead as ditch water, and my distaste for the prolongation of my mortal span had come back upon me more strongly than ever. Besides, we neither of us knew what the effects of the fire might be. The result upon She had not been of an encouraging nature, and of the exact causes that produced that result we were of course ignorant. "Well, my boy," I said, "we cannot stop here till we go the way of those two," and I pointed to the little heap under the white garment and to the stiffening corpse of poor Job. "If we are going we had better go. But, by the way, I expect that the lamps have burned out," and I took one up and looked at it, and sure enough it had. "There is some more oil in the vase," said Leo indifferently, "if it is not broken at least." I examined the vessel in question. It was intact. With a trembling hand I filled the lamps. Luckily there was still some of the linen wick unburnt. Then I lit them with one of our wax matches. While I did so we heard the pillar of fire approaching once more as it went on its never ending journey, if indeed it was the same pillar that passed and repassed in a circle. "Let's see it come once more," said Leo. "We shall never look upon its like again in this world." It seemed a bit of idle curiosity, but somehow I shared it, and so we waited till, turning slowly round upon its own axis, it had flamed and thundered by. And I remember wondering for how many thousands of years this same phenomenon had been taking place in the bowels of the earth, and for how many more thousands it would continue to take place. I wondered also if any mortal eyes would ever again mark its passage, or any mortal ears be thrilled and fascinated by the swelling volume of its majestic sound. I do not think that I will. I believe that we are the last human beings who will ever see that unearthly sight. Presently it had gone, and we too turned to go. But before we did so we each took Job's cold hand in ours and shook it. It was a rather ghastly ceremony, but it was the only means in our power of showing our respect to the faithful dead and of celebrating his obsequies. The heap beneath the white garment we did not uncover. We had no wish to look upon that terrible sight again, but we went to the pile of rippling hair that had fallen from her in the agony of that hideous change which was worse than 1,000 natural deaths, and each of us drew from it a shining lock, and these locks we still have, the sole memento that is left to us of Ayesha as we knew her in the fullness of her grace and glory. Leo pressed the perfumed hair to his lips. "She called to me not to forget her," he said hoarsely, "and swore that we should meet again. By Heaven, I never will forget her. Here I swear that if we live to get out of this I will not for all my days have anything to say to another living woman, and that wherever I go I will wait for her as faithfully as she waited for me." Yes, I thought to myself, if she comes back as beautiful as we knew her. But supposing she came back like that? Note. What a terrifying reflection it is, by the way, that nearly all our deep love for women who are not our kindred depends, at any rate in the first instance, upon their personal appearance. If we lost them and found them again dreadful to look on, though otherwise they were the very same, should we still love them? End of the note. Well, and then we went. We went and left those two in the presence of the very well and spring of life, but gathered to the cold company of death. How lonely they looked as they lay there, and how ill assorted. That little heap had been for 2,000 years the wisest, loveliest, proudest creature I can hardly call her woman in the whole universe. She had been wicked, too, in her way, but alas! such is the frailty of the human heart, her wickedness had not detracted from her charm. Indeed, I am by no means certain that it did not add to it. It was after all of a grand order, there was nothing mean or small about Ayesha. And poor Job too, his presentiment had come true, and there was an end of him. Well, he has a strange burial place. No Norfolk hind ever had a stranger, or ever will, and it is something to lie in the same sepulchre as the poor remains of the imperial she. We looked our last upon them and that indescribable rosy glow in which they lay, and then with hearts far too heavy for words we left them, and crept thence broken down men, so broken down that we even renounced the chance of partially immortal life because all that made life valuable had gone from us, and we knew even then that to prolong our days indefinitely would only be to prolong our sufferings, for we felt, yes, both of us, that having once looked Ayesha in the eyes, we could not forget her for ever and ever while memory and identity remained. We both loved her now and for all time. She was stamped and carven on our hearts, and no other woman or interest could ever raise that splendid die. And I, there lies the sting, I had and have no right to think thus of her. As she told me, I was naught to her, and never shall be through the unfathomed depths of time, unless, indeed, conditions alter, and a day comes at last when two men may love one woman, and all three be happy in the fact. It is the only hope of my broken-heartedness, and a rather faint one. Beyond it I have nothing. I have paid down this heavy price, all that I am worth here and hereafter, and that is my sole reward. With Leo it is different, and often I bitterly envy him his happy lot, for if she was right, and her wisdom and knowledge did not fail her at the last, which, arguing from the precedent of her own case, I think most unlikely, he has some future to look forward to. But I have none, and yet, mark the folly and the weakness of the human heart, and let him who is the wise learn wisdom from it. Yet I would not have it otherwise. I mean that I am content to give what I have given and must always give, and take in payment those crumbs that fall from my mistress's table, the memory of a few kind words, the hope one day in the far undreamed future of a sweet smile or two of recognition, a little gentle friendship, and a little show of thanks for my devotion to her and Leo. If that does not constitute true love, I do not know what does, and all I have to say is that it is a very bad state of affairs for a man on the wrong side of middle age to fall into. End of the chapter 26. Chapter 27 of She by H. Rider Haggard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristine. She by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 27 We Leap. We passed through the caves without trouble, but when we came to the slope of the inverted cone, two difficulties stared us in the face. The first of these was the laborious nature of the ascent, and the next the extreme difficulty of finding our way. Indeed, had it not been for the mental notes that I had fortunately taken of the shapes of various rocks, I am sure that we never should have managed it at all, but have wandered about in the dreadful womb of the volcano, for I suppose it must once have been something of the sort, until we died of exhaustion and despair. As it was, we went wrong several times, and once nearly fell into a huge crack or crevasse. It was terrible work, creeping about in the dense gloom and awful stillness from boulder to boulder, and examining it by the feeble light of the lamps to see if I could recognize its shape. We rarely spoke, our hearts were too heavy for speech. We simply stumbled about, falling sometimes and cutting ourselves, in a rather dogged sort of way. The fact was that our spirits were utterly crushed, and we did not greatly care what happened to us. Only we felt bound to try and save our lives whilst we could, and indeed a natural instinct prompted us to it. So for some 3 or 4 hours, I should think, I cannot tell exactly how long, for we had no watch left that would go, we blundered on. During the last 2 hours we were completely lost, and I began to fear that we had gone into the funnel of some subsidiary cone, when at last I suddenly recognized a very large rock which we had passed in descending but a little way from the top. It is a marvel that I should have recognized it, and indeed, we had already passed it going at right angles to the proper path, when something about it struck me, and I turned back and examined it in an idle sort of way, and, as it happened, this proved our salvation. After this we gained the rocky natural stair without much further trouble, and in due course found ourselves back in the little chamber where the benighted Nood had lived and died. But now a fresh terror stared us in the face. It will be remembered that owing to Job's fear and awkwardness, the plank upon which we had crossed from the huge spur to the rocking stone had been whirled off into the tremendous gulf below. How were we to cross without the plank? There was only one answer. We must try and jump it, or else stop there till we starved. The distance in itself was not so very great, between 11 and 12 feet I should think, and I have seen Leo jump over 20 when he was a young fellow at college, but then think of the conditions: 2 weary, worn out men, one of them on the wrong side of 40, a rocking stone to take off from, a trembling point of rock some few feet across to land upon, and a bottomless gulf to be cleared in a raging gale. It was bad enough, God knows, but when I pointed out these things to Leo, he put the whole matter in a nutshell by replying that, merciless as the choice was, we must choose between the certainty of the lingering death in the chamber and the risk of a swift one in the air. Of course there was no arguing against this, but one thing was clear: we could not attempt that leap in the dark. The only thing to do was to wait for the ray of light which pierced through the gulf at sunset. How near or how far from sunset we might be, Neither of us had the faintest notion. All we did know was that when at last the light came it would not endure more than a couple of minutes at the outside, so that we must be prepared to meet it. Accordingly, we made up our minds to creep on to the top of the rocking stone and lie there in readiness. We were the more easily reconciled to this course by the fact that our lamps were once more nearly exhausted; indeed, one had gone out bodily, and the other was jumping up and down as the flame of a lamp does when the oil is done. So, by the aid of its dying light, we hastened to crawl out of the little chamber and clamber up the side of the great stone. As we did so, the light went out. The difference in our position was a sufficiently remarkable one. Below, in the little chamber, we had only heard the roaring of the gale overhead. Here, lying on our faces on the swinging stone, we were exposed to its full force and fury, as the great draught drew first from this direction and then from that, howling against the mighty precipice and through the rocky cliffs like 10,000 despairing souls. We lay there hour after hour in terror and misery of mind so deep that I will not attempt to describe it, and listened to the wild storm voices of that Tartarus, as, set to the deep undertone of the spur opposite against which the wind hummed like some awful harp, they called to each other from precipice to precipice. No nightmare dreamed by man, no wild invention of the romancer, can ever equal the living horror of that place, and the weird crying of those voices of the night, as we clung like shipwrecked mariners to a raft, and tossed on the black, unfathomed wilderness of air. Fortunately the temperature was not a low one. Indeed the wind was warm, or we should have perished. So we clung and listened, and while we were stretched out upon the rock a thing happened, which was so curious and suggestive in itself, though doubtless a mere coincidence, that, if anything, it added to, rather than deducted from, the burden on our nerves. It will be remembered that when Ayesha was standing on the spur, before we crossed to the stone, the wind tore her cloak from her, and whirled it away into the darkness of the gulf, we could not see whither. Well, I hardly like to tell the story, it is so strange. As we lay there upon the rocking stone, this very cloak came floating out of the black space, like a memory from the dead, and fell on Leo, so that it covered him nearly from head to foot. We could not at first make out what it was, but soon discovered by its feel, and then poor Leo, for the first time, gave away, and I heard him sobbing there upon the stone. No doubt the cloak had been caught upon some pinnacle of the cliff, and was thence blown hither by a chance gust, but still it was a most curious and touching incident. Shortly after this, suddenly, without the slightest previous warning, the great red knife of light came stabbing the darkness through and through, struck the swaying stone on which we were, and rested its sharp point upon the spur opposite. "Now for it," said Leo, "now or never." We rose and stretched ourselves, and looked at the cloud wreath stained the colour of blood by that red ray as they tore through the thickening depths beneath, and then at the empty space between the swaying stone and the quivering rock, and in our hearts despaired and prepared for death. Surely we could not clear it, desperate though we were. "Who is to go first?" said I. "Do you, old fellow," answered Leo. "I will sit upon the other side of the stone to steady it. You must take as much run as you can and jump high, and God have mercy on us, say I." I acquiesced with a nod, and then I did a thing I had never done since Leo was a little boy. I turned and put my arm round him and kissed him on the forehead. It sounds rather French, but as a fact I was taking my last farewell of a man whom I could not have loved more if he had been my own son twice over. "Good bye, my boy," I said. "I hope that we shall meet again, wherever it is that we go to." The fact was I did not expect to live another 2 minutes. Next I retreated to the far side of the rock and waited till one of the chopping gusts of wind got behind me, and then I ran the length of the huge stone, some 3 or 4 and 30 feet, and sprang wildly out into the dizzy air. Oh, the sickening terrors that I felt as I launched myself at that little point of rock, and the horrible sense of despair that shot through my brain as I realized that I had jumped short. But so it was, my feet never touched the point, they went down into space, only my hands and body came into contact with it. I gripped at it with a yell, but one hand slipped, and I swung right round, holding by the other, so that I faced the stone from which I had sprung. Wildly I stretched up with my left hand, and this time managed to grasp a knob of rock, and there I hung in the fierce red light, with thousands of feet of empty air beneath me. My hands were holding to either side of the under part of the spur, so that its point was touching my head. Therefore, even if I could have found the strength, I could not pull myself up. The most that I could do would be to hang for about a minute and then drop down into the bottomless pit. If any man can imagine a more hideous position, let him speak. All I know is that the torture of that half minute nearly turned my brain. I heard Leo give a cry, and then suddenly saw him in mid air springing up and out like a chamois. It was a splendid leap that he took under the influence of his terror and despair, clearing the horrible gulf as if it were nothing, and landing well on the rocky point. He threw himself upon his face to prevent his pitching off into the depths. I felt the spur above me shake beneath the shock of his impact, and as it did so I saw the huge rocking stone, that had been violently depressed by him as he sprang, fly back when relieved of its weight till, for the first time during all these centuries, it got beyond its balance, fell with a most awful crash right into the rocky chamber which had once served the philosopher Knut for a hermitage, and, I have no doubt, for ever sealed the passage that leads to the place of life with some hundreds of tons of rock. All this happened in a second, and curiously enough, notwithstanding my terrible position, I noted it involuntarily, as it were. I even remember thinking that no human being would go down that dread path again. Next instant I felt Leo seize me by the right wrist with both hands. By lying flat on the point of rock he could just reach me. "You must let go and swing yourself clear," he said in a calm and collected voice, "and then I will try and pull you up, or we will both go together. Are you ready?" By way of answer I let go, first with my left hand and then with the right, and, as a consequence, swayed out clear of the overshadowing rock, my weight hanging upon Leo's arms. It was a dreadful moment. He was a very powerful man, I knew, but would his strength be equal to lifting me up till I could get a hold on the top of the spur, when owing to his position he had so little purchase? For a few seconds I swung to and fro, while he gathered himself for the effort, and then I heard his sinews cracking above me, and felt myself lifted up as though I were a little child, till I got my left arm round the rock, and my chest was resting on it. The rest was easy. In 2 or 3 more seconds I was up, and we were lying panting side by side, trembling like leaves, and with the cold perspiration of terror pouring from our skins. And then, as before, the light went out like a lamp. For some half hour we lay thus without speaking a word, and then at length began to creep along the great spur, as best we might in the dense gloom. As we drew towards the face of the cliff, however, from which the spur sprang out like a spike from a wall, the light increased, though only a very little, for it was night overhead. After that the gusts of wind decreased, and we got along rather better, and at last reached the mouth of the first cave or tunnel. But now a fresh trouble stared us in the face. Our oil was gone, and the lamps were, no doubt, crushed to powder beneath the fallen rocking stone. We were even without a drop of water to stay our thirst, for we had drunk the last in the chamber of Knut. How were we to seek to make our way through this last boulder strewn tunnel? Clearly all that we could do was to trust to our sense of feeling, and attempt the passage in the dark. So in we crept, fearing that if we delayed to do so our exhaustion would overcome us, and we should probably lie down and die where we were. Oh, the horrors of that last tunnel! The place was strewn with rocks, and we fell over them, and knocked ourselves up against them till we were bleeding from a score of wounds. Our only guide was the side of the cavern, which we kept touching, and so bewildered did we grow in the darkness that we were several times seized with the terrifying thought that we had turned and were travelling the wrong way. On we went, feebly and still more feebly, for hour after hour, stopping every few minutes to rest, for our strength was spent. Once we fell asleep, and I think must have slept for some hours, for, when we woke, our limbs were quite stiff, and the blood from our blows and scratches had caked, and was hard and dry upon our skin. Then we dragged ourselves on again, till at last, when despair was entering into our hearts, we once more saw the light of day, and found ourselves outside the tunnel in the rocky fold, on the outer surface of the cliff that, it will be remembered, led into it. It was early morning, that we could tell by the feel of the sweet air and the look of the blessed sky, which we had never hoped to see again. It was, so near as we knew, an hour after sunset when we entered the tunnel, so it followed that it had taken us the entire night to crawl through that dreadful place. "One more effort, Leo," I gasped, "and we shall reach the slope where Billali is, if he hasn't gone. Come, don't give way," for he had cast himself upon his face. He rose, and, leaning on each other, we got down that 50 feet or so of cliff, somehow, I have not the least notion how. I only remember that we found ourselves lying in a heap at the bottom, and then once more began to drag ourselves along on our hands and knees towards the grove where She had told Billali to wait her arrival, for we could not walk another foot. We had not gone 50 yards in this fashion when suddenly one of the mutes emerged from the trees on our left, through which, I presume, he had been taking a morning stroll, and came running up to see what sort of strange animals we were. He stared and stared and then held up his hand in horror, and nearly fell to the ground. Next he started off as hard as he could for the grove some 200 yards away. No wonder that he was horrified at our appearance, for we must have been a shocking sight. To begin, Leo, with his golden curls turned a snowy white, his clothes nearly rent from his body, his worn face and his hands a mass of bruises, cuts, and blood encrusted filth, was a sufficiently alarming spectacle, as he painfully dragged himself along the ground, and I have no doubt that I was little better to look on. I know that 2 days afterwards, when I inspected my face in some water, I scarcely recognized myself. I have never been famous for beauty, but there was something beside ugliness stamped upon my features that I have never got rid of until this day, something resembling that wild look with which a startled person wakes from deep sleep, more than anything else that I can think of. And really, it is not to be wondered at. What I do wonder at is that we escaped at all with our reason. Presently, to my intense relief, I saw old Billali hurrying towards us, and even then I could scarcely help smiling at the expression of consternation on his dignified countenance. "Oh, my baboon!" he cried, "my dear son, is it indeed thee and the lion? Why, his mane that was ripe as corn is white like the snow. Whence come ye? And where is the pig, and where too she who must be obeyed?" "Dead, both dead," I answered, "but ask no questions, help us, and give us food and water, or we too shall die before thine eyes. Seest thou not that our tongues are black for want of water? How then can we talk?" "Dead!" he gasped. "Impossible! She, who never dies, dead! How can it be?" And then, perceiving I think that his face was being badged by the mutes who had come running up, he checked himself, and motioned to them to carry us to the camp, which they did. Fortunately when we arrived some broth was boiling on the fire, and with this Billali fed us, for we were too weak to feed ourselves, thereby, I firmly believe, saving us from death by exhaustion. Then he bade the mutes wash the blood and grime from us with wet cloths, and after that we were laid down upon piles of aromatic grass, and instantly fell into the dead sleep of absolute exhaustion of mind and body. End of the chapter 27. We leap. Chapter 28. Of She by H. Rider Haggard. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristine. She by H. Rider Haggard. Chapter 28. Over the Mountain. The next thing I recollect is a feeling of the most dreadful stiffness, and a sort of vague idea passing through my half awakened brain that I was a carpet that had just been beaten. I opened my eyes, and the first thing they fell on was the venerable countenance of my old friend Billali, who was seated by the side of the improvised bed upon which I was sleeping, and thoughtfully stroking his long beard. The sight of him at once brought back to my mind a recollection of all that we had recently passed through, which was accentuated by the vision of poor Leo lying opposite to me, his face knocked almost to a jelly, and his beautiful crown of curls turned from yellow to white. Note. Curiously enough, Leo's hair has lately been to some extent regaining its color, that is to say, it's now a yellowish gray, and I am not without hopes that it will in time come quite right. End of the note. And I shut my eyes again and groaned. "Thou hast slept long, my baboon," said old Billali. "How long, my father?" I asked. "A round of the sun and a round of the moon, a day and a night hast thou slept, and the lion also. See, he sleepeth yet." "Blessed is sleep," I answered, "for it swallows up recollection." "Tell me," he said, "what hath befallen you, and what is this strange story of the death of her who dieth not? Bethink thee, my son, if this be true, then is thy danger and the danger of the lion very great, nay, almost is the pot red wherewith ye shall be potted, and the stomachs of those who shall eat ye are already hungry for the feast. Knowest thou not that these Amahagga, my children, these dwellers in the caves, hate ye? They hate ye as strangers, they hate ye more because of their brethren, whom she put to the torment for your sake. Assuredly, if once they learn that there is naught to fear from Hiya, from the terrible one who must be obeyed, they will slay ye by the pot. But let me hear thy tale, my poor baboon." This adjured, I set to work and told him, not everything, indeed, for I did not think it desirable to do so, but sufficient for my purpose, which was to make him understand that she was really no more, having fallen into some fire, and, as I put it, for the real thing would have been incomprehensible to him, been burnt up. I also told him some of the horrors we had undergone in effecting our escape, and these produced a great impression on him. But I clearly saw that he did not believe in the report of Ayesha's death. He believed indeed that we thought that she was dead, but his explanation was that it had suited her to disappear for a while. Once, he said, in his father's time she had done so for 12 years, and there was a tradition in the country that many centuries back no one had seen her for a whole generation, when she suddenly reappeared, and destroyed a woman who had assumed the position of queen. I said nothing to this, but only shook my head sadly. Alas! I knew too well that Ayesha would appear no more, or at any rate that Billali would never see her again. "And now," concluded Billali, "what wouldst thou do, my baboon?" "Nay," I said, "I know not, my father. Can we not escape from this country?" He shook his head. "It is very difficult. By Kufr we cannot pass, for you would be seen. And as soon as these fierce ones found that ye were alone, well," and he smiled significantly, and made a movement as though he were placing a hat on his head. "But there is a way over the cliff whereof I once spake to thee, where they drive the cattle out of pasture. Then beyond the pastures are 3 days' journey through the marshes, and after that I know not, but I have heard that 7 days' journey from thence is a mighty river, which floweth to the black water. If you could come thither, perchance ye might escape, but how can ye come thither?" "Billali," I said, "once, thou knowest, I did save thy life. Now pay back the debt, my father, and save me mine and my friends the lions. It shall be a pleasant thing for thee to think of when thine hour comes, and something to set in the scale against the evil doing of thy days, if perchance thou hast done any evil. Also, if thou be right, and if She doth but hide herself, surely when she comes again she shall reward thee." "My son the baboon," answered the old man, "think not that I have an ungrateful heart. Well do I remember how thou didst rescue me when those dogs stood by to see me drown. Measure for measure will I give thee, and if thou canst be saved surely I will save thee. Listen. By dawn tomorrow be prepared, for litters shall be here to bear ye away across the mountains and through the marshes beyond. This will I do, saying that it is the word of She, that it be done, and he who obeyeth not the word of She, food is he for the hyenas. Then, when ye have crossed the marshes, ye must strike with your own hands, so that perchance, if good fortune go with you, ye may live to come to that black water whereof ye told me. And now, see, the lion wakes, and ye must eat the food I have made ready for you." Leo's condition, when once he was fairly aroused, proved not to be so bad as might have been expected from his appearance, and we both of us managed to eat a hearty meal, which indeed we needed sadly enough. After this we limped down to the spring and bathed, and then came back and slept again till evening, when we once more ate enough for 5. Billali was away all that day, no doubt making arrangements about litters and bearers, for we were awakened in the middle of the night by the arrival of a considerable number of men in the little camp. At dawn the old man himself appeared, and told us that he had, by using She's dreadful name, though with some difficulty, succeeded in getting the necessary men and 2 guides to conduct us across the swamps, and that he urged us to start at once, at the same time announcing his intention of accompanying us so as to protect us against treachery. I was much touched by this act of kindness on the part of that wily old barbarian towards 2 utterly defenceless strangers, a 3, or, in his case, for he would have to return, 6 days' journey through those deadly swamps was no light undertaking for a man of his age, but he consented to do it cheerfully in order to promote our safety. It shows that even among those dreadful Amahagga, who are certainly with their gloom and their devilish and ferocious rites by far the most terrible savages that I ever heard of, there are people with kindly hearts. Of course, self-interest may have had something to do with it. He may have thought that She would suddenly reappear and demand an account of us at his hands, but still, allowing for all deductions, it was a great deal more than we could expect under the circumstances, and I can only say that I shall for as long as I live cherish a most affectionate remembrance of my nominal parent, old Billali. Accordingly, after swallowing some food, we started in the litters, feeling, so far as our bodies went, wonderfully like our old selves after our long rest and sleep. I must leave the condition of our minds to the imagination. Then came a terrible pull up the cliff. Sometimes the ascent was more natural, more often it was a zigzag roadway cut, no doubt in the first instance by the old inhabitants of Kufr. The Amahagger say they drive their spare cattle over it once a year to pasture outside. All I know is that those cattle must be uncommonly active on their feet, Of course the litters were useless here, and we had to walk. By midday, however, we reached the great flat top of that mighty wall of rock, and grand enough the view was from it, with the plain of Kafir, in the centre of which we could clearly make out the pillared ruins of the Temple of Truth to the one side, and the boundless and melancholy marsh on the other. This wall of rock, which had no doubt once formed the lip of the crater, was about a mile and a half thick, and still covered with clinker. Nothing grew there, and the only thing to relieve our eyes were occasional pools of rain water, for rain had lately fallen, wherever there was a little hollow. Over the flat crest of this mighty rampart we went, and then came the descent, which, if not so difficult a matter as the getting up, was still sufficiently breakneck, and took us till sunset. That night, however, we camped in safety upon the mighty slopes that rode away to the marsh beneath. On the following morning about 11 o'clock began our dreary journey across those awful seas of swamps which I have already described. For 3 whole days, through stench and mire and the all prevailing flavour of fear, did our bearers struggle along, till at length we came to open rolling ground, quite uncultivated, and mostly treeless, but covered with game of all sorts, which lies beyond that most desolate, and without guides utterly impracticable district. And here on the following morning we bade farewell, not without some regret, to old Billali, who stroked his white beard and solemnly blessed us. "Farewell, my son the baboon," he said, "and farewell to thee too, O Lion. I can do no more to help you, but if ever ye come to your country, be advised, and venture no more into lands that ye know not, lest ye come back no more, but leave your white bones to mark the limit of your journeyings. Farewell once more. Often shall I think of you, nor wilt thou forget me, my baboon, for though thy face is ugly, thy heart is true." And then he turned and went, and with him went the tall and sullen looking bearers, and that was the last that we saw of the Amahagger. We watched them winding away with the empty litters like a procession, bearing dead men from a battle, till the mist from the marsh gathered round them and hid them, and then, left utterly desolate in the vast wilderness, we turned and gazed round us and at each other. 3 weeks or so before, 4 men had entered the marshes of Kafir, and now 2 of us were dead, and the other 2 had gone through adventures and experiences so strange and terrible that Death himself hath not a more fearful countenance. 3 weeks, and only 3 weeks! Truly time should be measured by events and not by the lapse of hours. It seemed like 30 years since we saw the last of our whale boat. "We must strike out for the Zambesi, Leo," I said, "but God knows if we shall ever get there." Leo nodded. He had become very silent of late, and we started with nothing but the clothes we stood in, a compass, our revolvers and express rifles, and about 200 rounds of ammunition, and so ended the history of our visit to the ancient ruins of mighty and imperial Kafir. As for the adventures that subsequently befell us, strange and varied as they were, I have, after deliberation, determined not to record them here. In these pages I have only tried to give a short and clear account of an occurrence which I believe to be unprecedented, and this I have done, not with a view to immediate publication, but merely to put on paper, while they are yet fresh in our memories, the details of our journey and its result, which will, I believe, prove interesting to the world if ever we determine to make them public. This, as at present advised, we do not intend should be done during our joint lives. For the rest, it is of no public interest, resembling as it does the experience of more than one Central African traveller. Suffice it to say that we did, after incredible hardships and privations, reach the Zambesi, which proved to be about 170 miles south of where Billali left us. There we were for 6 months imprisoned by a savage tribe, who believed us to be supernatural beings, chiefly on account of Leo's youthful face and snow white hair. From these people we ultimately escaped, and, crossing the Zambesi, wandered off southwards, where, When on the point of starvation we were sufficiently fortunate to fall in with a half caste Portuguese elephant hunter who had followed a troop of elephants farther inland than he had ever been before. This man treated us most hospitably, and ultimately through his assistance we, after innumerable sufferings and adventures, reached Delagoa Bay, more than 18 months from the time when we emerged from the marshes of Kafir, and the very next day managed to catch one of the steamboats that ran round the Cape to England. Our journey home was a prosperous one, and we set our foot on the quay at Southampton exactly 2 years from the date of our departure upon our wild and seemingly ridiculous quest. And I now write these last words with Leo leaning over my shoulder in my old room in my college, the very same into which some 22 years ago my poor friend Vincey came stumbling on the memorable night of his death, bearing the iron chest with him. And that is the end of this history, so far as it concerns science and the outside world. What its end will be as regards Leo and myself is more than I can guess at. But we feel that it is not reached yet. A story that began more than 2000 years ago may stretch a long way into the dim and distant future. Is Leo really a reincarnation of the ancient Callicrates of whom the inscription tells? Or was Ayesha deceived by some strange hereditary resemblance? The reader must form his own opinion on this as on many other matters. I have mine, which is that she made no such mistake. Often I sit alone at night, staring with the eyes of the mind into the blackness of unborn time, and wondering in what shape and form the great drama will be finally developed, and where the scene of its next act will be laid. And when that final development ultimately occurs, as I have no doubt it must and will occur, in obedience to a fate that never swerves and a purpose that cannot be altered, what will be the part played therein by that beautiful Egyptian Amenartas, the princess of the royal race of the Pharaohs, for the love of whom the priest Callicrates broke his vows to Isis, and pursued by the inexorable vengeance of the outraged goddess, fled down the coast of Libya to meet his doom at Kafr. End of chapter 28. Over the Mountain. And the end of the book. She by H. Rider Haggard.